Rich guests. Mock a waiter on a luxury yacht. Then Morgan Freeman stuns everyone with his response. The moonlight shimmered on the endless ocean, casting silver reflections across the pristine deck of the Celestial, a luxury yacht where only the world's wealthiest mingled under the stars. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved swiftly, ensuring that champagne glasses never emptied, that every guest's slightest desire was met without hesitation. Does true power come from wealth or dignity? Comment 1 for dignity, 0 if you think money rules the world. Among them was Daniel, a young man barely in his 20s, balancing a tray of drinks with the kind of focus that only came from necessity. This wasn't just a job for him, it was survival. Every tip, every shift, every painstaking hour on his feet was for something bigger. Paying for his mother's medical bills, saving for a future beyond this yacht. But tonight, all his hard work would be reduced to a cruel joke in the eyes of the elite. "Oh dear, look at that." The mocking voice sliced through the air, sharp as broken glass. Before Daniel could react, cold liquid drenched his uniform, soaking through his shirt, trickling down his arms. Gasps rippled through the deck as guests turned toward the commotion. Standing at the center of it all was Elliot Beaumont, a billionaire investor whose arrogance was as expensive as the watch on his wrist. He smirked, his empty champagne flute still in hand. "A little slip-up, Elliot drawled, his voice oozing with amusement. "Or is this just part of your job? Cleaning up after people like me?" The laughter wasn't real. It wasn't about the joke. It was about who told it. When Elliot spoke, people laughed because wealth demanded it. Daniel stood frozen, his face burning. He wanted to disappear, to walk away, to fight back. But what could he do? He was just the help. And then, a voice, deep, slow, and unmistakable, cut through the night like distant thunder. Now that's an interesting way to treat someone. Elliot turned, expecting to see another sycophant laughing along, but instead he locked eyes with Morgan Freeman. And in that moment, everything changed. The moonlight shimmered against the waves, casting silver streaks across the pristine deck of the Celestial, a yacht so extravagant that even the air carried the scent of exclusivity. The hum of conversation, the soft clink of crystal glasses, and the distant melody of a live jazz band created an ambiance of effortless luxury. For the guests on board, this wasn't just another night, it was an opportunity to flaunt wealth, to sip on drinks older than most of the staff serving them, and to remind themselves of their position at the top of the world. And then there was Daniel. A young waiter barely in his 20s, he moved carefully through the crowd, balancing a tray of Dom Perignon with the kind of precision that came from months of relentless training. He had been warned. The guests aboard the Celestial weren't just rich, they were powerful, untouchable, the kind of people who could ruin a man with a flick of their wrist. For Daniel, this wasn't just a job. It was survival. Every tip, every shift, every painstaking hour spent on his feet was for something bigger. His mother's medical bills, the chance to finally escape the cycle of struggle he had been born into. But tonight, all his hard work would be reduced to nothing more than a cruel joke. The game begins. "Oh dear, look at that." The words rang out like a shot through the air, sharp, mocking. Daniel barely had time to react before cold liquid seeped through his crisp white uniform, soaking through the fabric, chilling his skin. A collective gasp rippled across the deck, followed by a murmur of amused whispers. Standing at the center of it all, lounging in his seat with an air of casual superiority, was Elliot Beaumont, a billionaire investor, a man who had never heard the word no in his life, a man who wore arrogance like an accessory, his expensive silk shirt tailored so perfectly that it barely wrinkled, as he lifted his empty champagne flute, swirling the remnants at the bottom like a cat toying with its prey. "A little slip-up, Elliot drawled, his voice thick with amusement. Daniel froze. His pulse roared in his ears, but he knew better than to react. He had seen this before. Men like Elliot didn't spill drinks by accident. They did it for sport. For men like him, humiliation was just another form of entertainment. Daniel straightened, quickly reaching for a napkin. I'm sorry, sir, he said, his voice even. I'll clean that up right away. But Elliot wasn't done playing. He leaned back in his seat, casting a glance at his companions. Other millionaires. Men who laughed when he laughed, who nodded when he spoke, who lived in his shadow and were grateful for it. No need, boy, Elliot said smoothly, his smirk widening. Just make sure you don't spill it again. Unless, of course, you enjoy being on your knees. Laughter exploded around them, not because it was funny, but because when a man as rich as Elliot made a joke, people laughed. The unspoken rules of the rich Daniel's fingers curled around the napkin, the fabric twisting in his grip. He wanted to disappear, to walk away, to fight back. But what could he do? He was just the help. If he spoke, he'd be fired. If he reacted, he'd never work on a yacht again. So he swallowed the sharp sting of humiliation and bent down to clean the mess. His face burning as he felt their eyes on him, mocking, scrutinizing, waiting to see if he would crack. And then a voice, deep, slow, deliberate, rolled across the deck like distant thunder. Now, that's an interesting way to treat someone. The laughter died instantly. The weight of those words settled over the crowd, turning heads, stilling conversations. Elliot's smirk faltered as he turned toward the source. And there, standing near the edge of the deck, watching the scene unfold with an unreadable expression, was Morgan Freeman. For a moment, no one moved. Morgan Freeman had been on the yacht all evening, a quiet presence amid the excess. He hadn't drawn attention to himself, hadn't needed to. His very presence commanded respect. Now, as he stepped forward, the atmosphere shifted. Gone was the careless amusement, the effortless cruelty. In its place was something far heavier. Elliot recovered quickly, forcing a chuckle. "Mr. Freeman," he greeted, flashing the same charming, practiced smile that had closed billion-dollar deals. "Didn't see you there. We were just having a little fun." Morgan's gaze flicked to Daniel, still kneeling, his uniform stained, his expression carefully blank. "Fun?" Morgan repeated, arching an eyebrow. Elliot shrugged, gesturing vaguely. "Come on, it's just a waiter. They're here to serve, aren't they?" A few people shifted uncomfortably, suddenly unsure whether they were still part of the joke. Morgan exhaled, his lips pressing into a thoughtful line. "Tell me something, Elliot," he said, his voice steady, measured. "What do you do for a living?" Elliot blinked, caught off guard. "I invest," he answered as if it were obvious. Morgan nodded. "So, you understand value?" Elliot relaxed slightly, sensing an opportunity to regain control. "Of course," he said smoothly. Morgan took another step forward, and suddenly, the space between them wasn't just physical, it was a challenge. "Then tell me," Morgan said, his voice soft but carrying the weight of an ocean, "what's the value of a man who cleans up after you?" The crowd fell utterly silent. Elliot hesitated. What? You heard me," Morgan said, his expression unreadable. "What's the return on investment for someone like him?" Elliot's smile tightened. "That's not how this works," he said, shifting uncomfortably. Morgan tilted his head. "No," he mused, "because from where I'm standing, I see a young man working harder in a single night than you have in your entire life." The air became thick, the tension almost unbearable. Guests who had laughed moments ago now looked away, suddenly interested in their drinks. Morgan didn't look away. "So, Elliot," he said, his voice dropping just slightly, making every syllable feel heavier. "Tell me, what exactly makes you more valuable than him?" Elliot had no answer. The silence that followed Morgan Freeman's words was thick, suffocating. It was the kind of silence that held more weight than 1,000 arguments, that made people shift uncomfortably in their seats, that forced reflection where mockery had once thrived. Elliot Beaumont, the billionaire investor who had spent his life commanding rooms, dictating conversations, and ensuring that he was always the most important man in any setting, now found himself at a rare loss for words. "What exactly makes you more valuable than him?" Morgan's question still hung in the air like an unspoken challenge, demanding an answer. But Elliot had none. Not one that would make him look good. Not one that wouldn't make him sound exactly like the man Morgan had just exposed him to be. The audience that had moments ago been so eager to laugh along with him now watched with quiet anticipation, their loyalties shifting. Because suddenly, Elliot was no longer the most powerful man on this yacht. Daniel, still kneeling, felt the shift before he fully understood it. A minute ago, he had been nothing. Just a nameless face in a white uniform, another invisible cog in the machine that catered to the elite. Now he was at the center of something far bigger than himself. For the first time since he had stepped onto the Celestial, he wasn't just a server. He was a man people were seeing. Morgan's presence alone had done that, had forced them all to acknowledge him, to confront the reality they had ignored for so long. And yet, even as the tension built, even as every eye remained locked onto the unfolding confrontation, Elliot still hadn't answered. He opened his mouth, closed it, cleared his throat, glanced around as if searching for an ally, someone who would step in and save him from the scrutiny now pressing down on him like a tidal wave. But no one spoke for him. Not this time. So finally he did what he always did when backed into a corner. He laughed. "Oh, come on," Elliot said, forcing amusement into his tone, though his grip on the table tightened just slightly. "Let's not be dramatic. I was just having a little fun." Morgan's gaze remained steady, unshaken. "Is that what you call it?" Elliot's smile faltered. "Look," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "I don't see the big deal here. I hire people like him every day. They need jobs, I provide them. That's value, isn't it?" A few heads turned, some eyebrows lifted. Morgan sighed, shaking his head slightly, as if he had seen this exact conversation play out before, as if he already knew the excuses before they left Elliot's mouth. "So, let me get this straight," Morgan said, crossing his arms. "Because you pay people for their labor, that makes you better than them." Elliot hesitated, but he wasn't one to back down easily. "It means I worked harder," he countered. "I earned my place here. And if someone like him wants more, he should do the same." Daniel stiffened at that. And he wasn't the only one. A low murmur rippled through the crowd, small but unmistakable, because it was easy to dismiss one person's suffering. It was harder to do so when you realized everyone around you had a story too. Morgan exhaled, taking a slow step closer, his presence looming even though he didn't raise his voice. "Let me ask you something, Elliot," he said, his tone almost conversational. "Where were you born?" Elliot blinked. "Excuse me, where were you born?" Morgan repeated. "New York," Elliot answered warily. "Rich parents?" Elliot paused for half a second too long. "Comfortable," he admitted. Morgan nodded. "Private school?" "Of course." "College? Ivy League?" Morgan tilted his head, studying him. "And yet, you think you worked harder than a man who started with nothing?" The deck fell utterly silent again. This time the weight was heavier, because Morgan wasn't just talking about Daniel anymore. He was talking about every single person in that crowd who had ever fought for something without a safety net. And Elliot? Elliot had just made the mistake of proving himself to be exactly what Morgan wanted the world to see him as. A man who had never struggled a day in his life, but believed he was superior simply because he had started the race closer to the finish line. Elliot felt the shift too. For the first time all night, he wasn't just the man with the money. He was the man who had lost control of the room. Daniel had never spoken out against a guest before. It wasn't just frowned upon, it was a guaranteed way to lose his job. But standing there, feeling the weight of Morgan Freeman's words settle over them all, something in him changed. He straightened just slightly. "Mr. Freeman," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "I don't think he'll understand. People like him never do." Elliot's head snapped toward him, his expression darkening. But before he could speak, Morgan chuckled. "Maybe not," he agreed. "But I didn't say this was for him." Elliot frowned. "Then who?" Morgan turned, looking out across the deck, his gaze sweeping over the guests who had once laughed but were now silent, thoughtful, uncomfortable. "For everyone else," he said simply, because this moment wasn't about humiliating Elliot. It was about making sure that the people who had laughed along with him understood why they had been wrong to do so. And they did. One by one, the guests who had once looked amused now looked ashamed, because it wasn't just Elliot who had been complicit. It had been all of them. Elliot felt the shift. He had walked onto the Celestial believing he was untouchable. Now he stood there drowning under the weight of a lesson he hadn't asked for, but desperately needed. He could feel his control slipping, his reputation cracking, his carefully built persona collapsing under the weight of Morgan Freeman's simple but devastating truths. And in that moment, he understood something terrifying. Money had never been power. Respect was, and right now he had none of it left. Elliot thought wealth made him invincible, but what happened next would prove that no amount of money could buy back dignity once it was lost. Elliot Beaumont had spent his entire life believing that wealth was the ultimate shield, that as long as he had money, he had power, that as long as he could buy his way into the finest rooms, sip the most expensive wine, and sit at the most exclusive tables, he was untouchable. But tonight he had learned something far more painful than any financial loss. Money could buy influence, but it couldn't buy dignity. Wealth could silence critics, but it couldn't erase shame. And respect. Respect was something no amount of zeros on a bank statement could secure. Elliot exhaled sharply, his gaze darting around the deck. He could feel it. The shift in the air, the weight of judgment pressing down on him. The same people who had once laughed along with him now avoided his eyes. The same guests who had nodded at his jokes now whispered among themselves, no longer entertained but embarrassed. Even the staff, the very people he had mocked, held their heads a little higher now. And the worst part? The person who had stripped him of his illusion of power hadn't even raised his voice. Morgan Freeman simply stood there, unshaken, unwavering, untouchable, in a way Elliot had never been. Elliot cleared his throat, forcing a smirk. "Well," he said, trying to recover, "I suppose I've been put in my place, haven't I?" Morgan gave him a long, measured look. "No, Elliot," he said finally. "I'm just reminding you that you were never above anyone else to begin with." The words landed heavier than any insult could have, because they weren't said in anger. They were said as truth. Elliot swallowed. For the first time in his life, he felt small in a way money couldn't fix. A painful truth settled in his chest. Power isn't in wealth. It's in how you treat the people who can do nothing for you. And he had failed that test. Elliot could have stormed off. He could have lashed out, deflected, pretended none of this mattered, but he didn't. Instead, he turned to Daniel. The young waiter who had been nothing more than background noise to him an hour ago now stood as a silent reminder of the kind of man he had chosen to be, and the kind of man he had the chance to become. For the first time that evening, Elliot actually saw him. "Kid," Elliot said, rubbing a hand over his face. The words felt foreign, like they didn't belong in his mouth. "I shouldn't have treated you like that." Daniel blinked, clearly not expecting an apology. Neither was anyone else. "I don't need your pity," Daniel said, keeping his voice steady. "Good," Elliot replied with a strained chuckle. "Because I wasn't offering it." A beat of silence. Then, to everyone's surprise, including his own, Elliot pulled a black credit card from his wallet and placed it on Daniel's tray. "Take the night off and get yourself something that doesn't reek of champagne." Daniel hesitated. Elliot sighed, shaking his head. "Don't make me look worse than I already do, kid. Just take it." Daniel studied him for a moment. Then finally he took the card. Not as a favor, not as charity, but as a shift in power. For the first time, Elliot wasn't the one in control. As Elliot turned to leave, Morgan Freeman called after him. "Elliot." The billionaire paused. Morgan stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "What you do next," Morgan said, will decide whether tonight was just another embarrassment or the moment you finally grew into the man you pretend to be. Elliot met his gaze. For the first time all night, he didn't have a clever reply. He simply nodded, and then, without another word, he walked away. The guests of the Celestial watched him go, then turned back to Morgan, to Daniel, to the aftermath of what had just unfolded. Because tonight wasn't just about one man being humbled. It was about every single person on that yacht realizing that wealth had never been the thing that made someone truly powerful. And as the ocean stretched endlessly around them, as the waves erased the footprints left on the deck, one truth remained unshaken. Respect is not bought. It is earned. Through this story, we realize that power isn't in money, titles, or influence. It's in character. Elliot believed wealth gave him the right to humiliate others. He thought respect was something granted to those with the biggest bank accounts. But he was wrong, because in the end, money can buy status, but it can't buy dignity. Morgan Freeman didn't just stand up for Daniel. He reminded an entire room that the true measure of a person is how they treat those who have nothing to offer them in return. Because in life, you are not remembered by how much you owned, but by how much kindness you showed.